Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Wow, that was a big introduction. Thank you, Peter. And thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you this afternoon. It's taken me a couple of hours to drive down the M1, but it's such a lovely day out there. So I suppose the primary objective is to make sure we bat through some stuff and get you out of here as soon as possible. So, and appreciate the temperature in here is a bit challenging. I'm going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes or so perhaps just sharing with you some thoughts and some of my experiences and some of the stuff that's going on up in the Midlands that might provoke some thought for you going forward. So as I say, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So I am a practice manager. Have we got practice managers in the room? I'm assuming plenty of you. Great. Okay, so that's what I do for a day job. I have experience of about 6 or 7 years in practice management. Prior to that, all of my experience was in a commercial background, but I'm currently practice manager of a 14,000 patient practice in Swadlincote, which is a small town in the south of Derbyshire. My commercial background, I've held various roles in multinational organisations, particularly within the discipline of HR. Boo at once, but that's my professional background and expertise and what I brought into practice management 6 or 7 years ago. I also hold a part-time role with the Derby and Derbyshire LMC. And up there we have what we call our GP task force. And that's a group of us that have been put together from all disciplines within general practice to facilitate change in general practice. So I get involved in all sorts of projects, ranging from practice mergers to, hey, we've got a problem with this process that we can't see our way through to sort out. And I have colleagues who also work in different practices as well. So I have quite a lot of practices that I go into in Derbyshire with that experience. One of the other things that I also do is I am part of the Royal College's Specialist Advisor group that are currently helping special measures practices, so those that find themselves falling foul of our wonderful regulators and trying to help them get through it. Now, I signed up for this about 18 months ago, completely forgetting that I was going to have to go through my own CQC inspection and then wondering how that might look as an RCGP special advisor. But thankfully we were also very pleased to receive an outstanding rating also in October of last year. And despite what some of my local practice manager colleagues think, I do actually have a life as well. I have quite an active social life, and I do lots of stuff outside of general practice too, so it's not all about GP. So thinking about some of the challenges, and a lot of this is old news now, but there's been a crisis in the NHS since 1948. If you talk to anybody who's been allowed, we've faced continuing crises over a period of time, so we can kind of take that as read. Although the 8th of June might change everything, of course. We might have a completely new set of obligations, but I doubt that very much. We all know about this stuff, so I won't dwell on it, but these are some of the key challenges that I think we are facing in general practice and continue to face, and I don't see any of these particularly going away, no matter what kind of model we might look at, what innovation we might come up with. I think some of these things are there and they're there to stay. But the last point I leave you with is this big is beautiful, but I say apparently because that's a matter for some opinion and some debate. So I guess the challenge for us in general practice is how we rise to this current crisis, if that's what we want to call it. And there's different ways that people have dealt with this around the country. And again, different practices I've been into in different organisations, I see quite a bit of that. I see quite a bit of people with their heads in their hands saying, I just don't know, I can't see a way through all of this stuff. And I see a fair bit of that as I go around the country too. And I'll leave it with you to decide where you're at with that slide. But what's the story so far? And again, this is the national picture, but I will touch on some of my experience in the West Midlands and East Midlands as we talk about some of this. So there's some successful examples out there of provider companies. There may be one in this area, I don't know, but there's quite a lot out there springing up that are, the primary focus is to bid for AQP contracts. So any qualified provider, we get a bunch of GPs who are probably shareholders in a separate company that sits somewhere else that will bid for these contracts. And there's some success with that across the country at the moment. We then got federations, but for me the jury's out on federations. I still don't know what they are. I don't know what it means. I don't fully have any grasp of the idea of federation and how that's really achieving anything out there. Again, these are all points to be challenged. I don't expect to sit here and you'll go, oh yes, that's right. But for me, one of the things that I have seen quite a bit of, with varying degrees of success, is the super partnership model and the corporate model, some people are calling it. And I'm going to just share with you a couple of examples. Now, Midlands Medical Partnership is an organisation based in Birmingham in the West Midlands, and Our Health Partnership is another one. Sutton Coldfield Group Practice, or SGP at the bottom, is an emerging super partnership that I'm actually going to go and work for on a permanent basis come the beginning of July. So that's a brand new merger that's just happening as we speak. These two organisations are both super partnerships, but very different in their setup and their approach and how they came together as organisations. And as I say, I've had the privilege to work with both of them. So I'll take Our Health Partnership to start with. This is the merger that Peter just touched on that I had some experience and help in bringing together, really. So 2015, 39 locations there are now. There's been some growth since its conception. 300,000 patients and 187 GP partners. That is a true partnership organisation in the traditional sense of the word. So there is a single overarching partnership deed that ties all of these GPs together. They were about 12 months in the making, which is a very short timescale. If anybody have been involved in any mergers or have experience of mergers, 12 months is not very long to achieve that. One of the ways that was achieved was thinking about form, rather than, to touch on your point, Steve, actually it was form that was the most important thing in the first place. And they decided that in order to be really successful in the future and really competitive, they needed to be bound together in a legal entity. What we managed to do with them was, rather than think super partnership, oh, we've all got to work the same appointment system, we've all got to do exactly the same thing, we've all got to work in the same way, they valued and recognised their differences as practices and valued and recognised the differences in their patient population. So each and every surgery location works in exactly the same way that it's always worked. The merger is back office based. It's all in the background, so the patients don't see any difference when they pitch up to their GP surgery. Each surgery also operates as an independent cost centre, which if any of you've got commercial backgrounds, you'll be familiar with the concept of cost centre. But basically each practice within the super partnership is allowed to function in whichever way it likes, and the partners in that particular area decide how much they want to profit share or not as a result of their actions. A slightly different setup. Midlands Medical Partnership have been around a good deal longer than that. And my first ever job in general practice was I was general manager for this organisation. Started off with 7 surgeries when I joined them in 2011. They've been formed since 2009. I was a slightly later addition. There were 7 locations to start with, now grown to 11 with 67,000 patients and 23 partners, and they have just been awarded an outstanding from the CQC, kind of proving that our regulators are up for this stuff. You know, you can, in terms of if you want to look to the regulator as their view of direction of travel, if you look through the CQC reports, there's an awful lot of outstanding out there where bigger is proving to be better. And we can all take a view on the regulations. So some of the positive stuff that these organisations are getting at the moment, from a patient's perspective, the patients are getting what they need, what they've been used to, what they're familiar with. But from the back office perspective, initially there was, for Midlands Medical Partnership particularly, didn't affect the other guys, but there was a slight drop in individual partner profit in year 1, but that righted itself in year 2 and 3. So I think in terms of opportunity, there is a cost of opportunity. I think that's one of the important messages. But it's about how enthused you are about working with a different model in the future as to how you deal with that. So if I were to pull out some of the key themes of these merging organisations and merged super partnerships, Oh yeah, just to say there are others out there that people. Yeah, modality is one of the most nationally written about super partnerships, also in the West Midlands. Again, operating in a slightly different way. So the key themes then to pull out from all of these organisations that I've had the opportunity to work with and have some experience of, they are all these super partnerships are a fully merged legal entity. There's no half measures with this. You're in it together. There is enthusiasm in abundance from the founding partners in the organisation. I'm sure Caroline's smiling because that's something that I think resonated with you as well in primary care home. The GPs are very, very enthusiastic and very positive. And unless those ingredients are in there, it's kind of difficult. They tend to be future gazers, so not people who are sitting looking at what's happening in front of their feet. They're looking much further into the distance about what's going on, particularly with the national picture. Very determined, determination to succeed and determination to do more with less. It's hard work. Anybody who tells you that merging organisations and working in bigger groupings is easy is telling you fibs. It is very hard work, but shared vision amongst these practices at the point that they were coming together was a real key theme of merger and super partnership. Commitment to outcomes. There's lots of people around these organisations who are saying, yeah, that's really nice, but what's the outcome? It's a question that's asked a lot in organisations of this type. Quality is very high on the agenda of all of these organisations. They are very patient-centred, despite what some people may say about these organisations. From where I've sat, they're very patient-centred organisations. The key thing they have is leadership. And again, I echo what Caroline was saying earlier. It has to be collective leadership. There's no such thing anymore if GP practices are going to move forward in a hierarchical approach, is what these organisations are finding. And running through all of it is a sense of humour. If you can't laugh about these things, you don't get anywhere. So those are just some of the things that I want to touch on. I also want to touch, because Peter mentioned my blog about practice management that's generated some interest. So we'll just go on and talk a little bit about how these new models are probably going to be managed in future versus the management of organisations that we have now. There's a history with the role of the practice manager, and those in the room will confirm this, that there is this real history. We've all come from varying backgrounds. Some of us are time-served receptionists who've worked our way through organisations into the role of practice manager. Some of us are maybe in it because we've been dealt it rather than because we've chosen it. There's a cohort of people who are out there looking to get into practice management from commercial backgrounds. So there's a whole different variety of people, and we have very different skills. I'm assuming it's the same here. That's certainly what's happening up in the Midlands. But we're all right, aren't we? Because practice managers, we've got everything under control, yeah? Know what we're doing? It's all a breeze. Day job's dead easy. So this is what we look like. But I suspect this is probably more what's going on out there, and I hear your agreement from the room. There's an important point to this, though, because I read a lot and talk a lot to GPs about GP burnout. I worry about practice manager burnout. This is the sort of thing that will cause practice managers to burn out in future. So every time there's a crisis in a practice, so we talk about the GP partners retiring, the GPs leaving, and everything, who's mopping it up? Because I know what happens in the Midlands, and I'm sure it's no different here. But as practice managers, I don't think we can carry on like this if we're going to work in these new models of general practice and how we're going to embrace that going forward. I think we probably need a radical change in our approach as practice managers as well about how we're going to work in these bigger groupings going forward. And I think we have to make sure we're fit for the future. So what does the next generation of practice management look like? We're collaborative across health systems. No longer do we sit in the practice with the doors shut and it's my little bit and that's it. All of the direction of travel is talking about collaboration across the health system, not just with our neighbouring practices. We're all really good at working with our neighbouring practices. Everywhere I go, that's the case. But how are we working with the wider health system? What are we doing? Practice managers of the future have to be leaders. they have to be at the top table. We also have to innovate and be an agent for change. So very often I meet practice managers drowning in paperwork and not necessarily very positive about the future, but if we're going to create a future for general practice and a future for patients, essentially, we have to be that agent for change. I think we're going to see more and more managers with specialist interests, not generalist skills. I think we're going to see more teams of practice management coming together where somebody is an HR specialist, somebody is a finance specialist, and I think we're going to radically change the way that we work in the future. If we haven't got that, I question whether we're in the right job, because I can't do my day job unless I've got energy and enthusiasm. But this is one of the really important things for me, is how we create a culture of continuous improvement in general practice. So I think we're really good at looking backwards in general practice rather than looking forwards. These are my observations, and I'm entirely opening up for questions shortly, and I do expect some challenge on some of these things. One of the things that I wrote about, and I do wholeheartedly believe this, is that practice management is a profession. It's not something that we just do in the daytime. It's actually, it should be a recognised profession, and we should be undertaking continuing professional development. Now, that doesn't mean just turning up to a conference once a year and going home with your carrier bag full of pens and post-it notes. It's a profession. How are we selling ourselves out there as a profession that's serious in general practice? You have to have an active role at your top table in your practice, and this is very much the flavour of what's happening in these bigger organisations. They're putting practice management at the top table, and I think we have to be active nationally as well. And again, these are some of the key themes from the blog. People often ask me, what about the future of the job title of the practice manager? Well, that's my answer to that. Call me what you like, judge me on what I do. I don't actually care about the job title of the future. It's an irrelevance to how we move forward in general practice. And if anybody is interested in reading the blog, I've just put a link there. And comments are really welcome. Blogs are put out there for people to make some comment on and get involved in some dialogue. So that's sort of a whistle-stop roundup of some of the experience that I've had, but I just leave you with this thought before we do open up to questions. This is a quote from John C. Maxwell, who wrote a book. He's an American writer. The book's called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. The GP 5-year forward view is the clearest indication we have on the table of how things are going to be in the future, and I don't see that looking any different from where I sit, either as a practice manager or having been involved in bigger groupings and going off to work in a bigger grouping again. We have to be taken seriously in general practice as a player, or I think we'll be left behind. There are people out there, other organisations, who are nipping at our heels, and if we don't engage and embrace this future, we're going to start to struggle as we go forward. So I'll leave you with that thought and open up for questions.
Well, if that doesn't generate some questions, I will be very surprised. I know it's hot, but I'm sure that was hotter. I'll kick off. I can see Alistair over there. I'll kick off with one question for you, Sarah. Give us some idea with these super practices how much dependence they have on their GMS contract for their income flow.
Yeah, okay, so initially the GMS contract or the PMS is vital, because if you haven't got your core business, then you lose your stability overnight. So core business is really, really key and important. But core business is the part of their organisations that they pay the least amount of attention to. And I don't mean that they deliberately ignore the fact that there's a GMS contract, but it's the bit that runs itself. They organise their back office so that stuff all carries on in the background, leaving the innovators free to go out and chase the new contracts and the new stuff, because there's new stuff out there all the time. Our health partnership, for instance, have been at the table with the Department of Health in terms of creating the next phase of how we move forward in general, but they were definitely at the national table for the formation of the STP, and certainly at the West Midlands table for the formation of the STP. So sustainability and transformation plans that all CCGs have put together across the country in terms of their response to the 5-year forward view. There will be one for this area, I'm sure.
There are two.
There's two. Oh, wow, okay, so
Come
really
on.
special.
You know we're special. There's 2 for this area.
So that it's allowing the innovators time out really to focus on winning contracts. Certainly the Sutton Coalfield group that I'm going to be working with, they're talking very in-depth discussions with local developers about building new surgery sites across the West Midlands, and also developing services out of their local hospital, which is a fairly decent sized hospital as well, and how we're going to work and pull those services away from the hospital and into the community. So the GMS is there and it's important, but it's the bit that runs itself, if that is helpful.
I'm going to sort of refer back to that shortly.
Yeah.
Dr. Cruikshank.
Hi, thank you. How did you get 187 partners to merge in 12 months?
Yeah, it was good. It was fun. A lot of it was about minimising the risk for individual partners, if I'm honest. So I'm sure GPs in Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire are very different, but my lot up there are all quite risk averse. So if they're going to go into something new, it has to be with the generally with the security that things are going to remain pretty much the same. So the way that they did that was to agree this cost centre model. So every individual practice still continues to run exactly as it is. So the things that the GPs were quite concerned about were, will I lose my ability to have an hour off on a Friday? Will I lose my ability to see 15 patients a session instead of 18 patients a session? Are you going to tell me how I must work in my day job as a GP? So those were the things that were really important to them. But stumbling across the idea of a cost centre, profit centre model meant that if they choose in their individual location to employ 3 doctors instead of 1, it's entirely within their gift to do it. They're only affecting their own profit as they would if they were in a normal setup per se. One of the big persuaders for most people was that CQC would no longer be an individual practice worry. So CQC is done on behalf of the whole organisation once, not 39 times. There's lots of stuff in there. Yeah, it's very attractive. Not having to worry about policies and procedures. So taking away a lot of the things that draw GPs away from the patients were managed centrally, and that was one of the really attractive selling points. It's a work in progress. They're into their 2nd year. They're finding things out as they go along, but it was basically about taking away workload with the minimal amount of risk, if I was going to sum it up.
Thank you for a very brilliant talk.
Thank you.
A follow-on question really to the last statement you made about the CQC being a central problem now rather than individual practices.
Yep.
So does it mean they don't just go visiting these individuals? How do they do their, assess individual consultation area, so to say?
Yeah.
How do they assess them, apart from the group admin setup?
Yeah, so it doesn't take away the fact that practices within the grouping will get a visit. It doesn't take away that. But the amount of visits that are done across the organisation will be less. There won't be a visit to every single site, for instance. But actually the stuff that it takes away are the things like policies. So forming a policy around medicines management, for instance, it's just the same policy that everybody follows and works with. So if you put yourself in the position of a CQC inspector, what you're looking at when you go into practice is making sure that a lot of the well, I wouldn't call it bureaucracy, but people may call it bureaucracy. Some of that bureaucratic parts of the CQC is already ticked off. So when they're visiting a site, as a selection of sites across the organisation, they're really looking at the ground level stuff, not the higher governance aspects of the CQC process. So again, they're working very closely with the CQC. What they've been able to do as a large organisation is actually get to the table with them and say, look, this is what we're doing, this is how we'd like you to work with us, this is how we think you'll inspect us. And they've had a really influential part on that process. We're waiting for them. They'll be around at some point, I'm sure. But yeah.
I must admit my answer to that question was that's their problem.
Yeah.
Dr. Slade.
Sure.
Thank you for that inspirational talk. But a question for you. because you know the future. I think,
Oh, I wish I did. Oh, I wish I was blessed.
I think this is the time. This is a very good time to think about vocational training for practice managers. Maybe I don't know, but if you know already, please can you let me know? If you don't know there's any, I think this is probably the time to think about it among these practice managers to create one rather than keep pinching from people like your organization, like HR and all those sort of. It's time because this is an important personnel for the changes that are going to happen.
Yeah.
It's about time we create our own.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and growing our own practice managers of the future is a really key and important part. There's quite a big chunk of the central government resilience money been allocated to practice manager development, so we'll wait and see what the government come up with for practice manager development, but I'm not holding my breath. There's quite a bit of stuff out there for practice managers and thinking about new skills and going forward. The Institute for Leadership and Management do some good stuff. The Institute for Healthcare Management have got some good stuff out there. But I think for the moment, in complete honesty and reality, I think as practice managers, we're a bit out there on our own still at the moment. But I do anticipate there will be some central government spend on practice manager development. But there is good stuff out there. But growing our own is really critical and important, and not just growing our own to fill the boots of the retiring practice manager to do the same stuff, but to grow our own to do something different in the future. That's really key.
Hi, Sarah. I'm afraid it's not a very exciting question, but I'm quite interested in the structure of the board of these super practices and how the decision making happens.
Yeah, okay. So again, both very similar. The organisations I've worked with have actually structured themselves in a very similar way, despite their differences in terms of how they're running on a day-to-day. So to start with, it was a steering group type arrangement pre-merger. So there was a steering group appointed, and that was sort of representatives of groupings of practices within the bigger thing that came together to talk about it. But at the point of merger, there was an election for a board of GPs to run the thing. So Midlands Medical Partnership have a board of 5 GPs that are elected from the 11 practices. The critical part of the role of the board member is not to be a practice representative, it's to be there to make decisions on behalf of the group, and that's the really key point. So elections are carried out, and they serve terms of office of 2 years, with the chairman serving a 3-year term. Their partnership deed sets out very specifically what responsibilities are delegated to the board to be able to decide, and what things have to come back to the wider partnership for decision making. There's only 2 or 3 things that have to come back to a whole partnership vote, and they are the things that you would expect. So it's the expulsion of a partner, the closing of a contract, and the dissolution of the partnership. So they're the only things really that have to come to a mass vote of all partners. But the management board are given delegated responsibility for day-to-day operations. They have a sign-off limit for finance. There's all of those sorts of things. So Midlands Medical Partnership, the early innovators, kind of paved the way for our health partnership, because they'd had 5 or 6 years at it before OHP formed. So they very much learnt from them. OHP have elected 7 GPs from across their organisation, but they've just partnered up with a group of GPs in Shropshire, so I think they'll have to reorganise their board a little bit to make sure that the Shropshire practices are included. But again, they're not representative of practices, and that's probably the most important bit. So sometimes a board member will find themselves making a decision that doesn't really suit their practice, but it's in the wider interests for the greater good. So they have to sort of wrangle with that as a GP board member. Our health partnership also have an executive team of 3. So there's an accountant, a chief exec, and a operations director that they've got as an exec team that work alongside the board as well. To support that decision making. So it's making the difference. I think one of the hardest things for GPs who move to a board position is to make the distinction between making an operational day-to-day decision and making a strategic decision in the longer term interests of the bigger grouping. So, but again, it's a 2-year term, so, and then they re-elect after 2 years. So there's some of them that have been elected time after time. There's some that have come and gone and been replaced by other GPs, but it does require an agreement as to what delegated responsibility looks like.
How often does the board meet?
Okay, so board meetings for our health partnership are twice a year. Partnership meetings are twice a year. Their board meetings are now monthly. They've dropped back to monthly from fortnightly. So again, early in your organisation, you need to think about doing things more frequently, more regularly, and in a more intense way. That drops back. Midlands Medical Partnership, their board meet once a month and their partners meet once a year. So it's a different dynamic, a different way of working.
James.
Hi.
Hi.
In terms of quality assurance, surveillance improvement,
Yep.
to what extent does the partnership attempt to sort of reduce unwarranted variation in health outcomes and improve consistency of practice? How does that work operationally, and has that been successful?
Yeah, so Midlands Medical Partnership, again, have been at it a longer time. OHP, I think, are still developing a lot of their internal governance processes. So I'll probably reflect back on Midlands Medical Partnership, if that's okay. They have an appointed medical director. So one of their board members is a medical director who has responsibility for implementing governance processes across the whole organisation. So they almost run a process within of a mini CQC inspection style regime. So they have appointed compliance people within the organisation who will carry out regular practice visits, regular site visits, and these are administrators. These are not super clever people that have to be paid a lot of money. These are people that will go out and check out infection control procedures. They'll look at policies. They'll make sure that things are being carried through the organisation. So it's very much a process internally under the direction of a medical director. And I think, again, if Midlands Medical Partnership probably didn't cotton onto that as quickly as they could have done, the importance of medical directorship within a grouping of practices. So.
Hi, forgive me, I may have missed something in this, but just in terms of the contracts, say the PMSs and the GMSs,
Yep.
still contracts with individual sites with NHS England or the CCG, depending on where they sit in terms of delegation.
Yeah.
So I've got a few points as well. In terms of legacy liabilities, was that sort of, effectively wipe the slate clean, so there's no legacy liabilities going forward? And in terms of the finances, is that looking at sort of pooled finances for new business over and above sort of core GMS and PMS?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just jotting them down so I make sure I answer all three of your points. Going back to the GMS, PMS stuff, the contracts are all held by the partnership. So every GMS contract, all the 187 partners are all partners in every GMS contract. So it was a process of working with the CCG to do the contract variation. So that was quite simple, she says. So it was just a contract variation as you would if you added or took away a partner in any other GMS contract. PMS was the same. It was just a variation process. And that's not stumbled across any real difficulties, although there is now that shared liability, as you rightly say. But with the regulations, of course, say that the contract is held by the partners that may vary from time to time. So it was a simple get through from a regulation point of view. Legacy liability was the second point, and the partnership deed that they signed when they formed the new organisations in both cases put a strict line in the sand of liabilities before and liabilities post. So if you're a four-partner practice before and something came out the woodwork a year down the line, that's your problem. If something comes out the woodwork post the merger, that's our problem. That was very much the ethos of the organisation. Finance, yes. Again, Midlands Medical Partnership are fully sharing across their 30 partners or whatever they are now. They're fully sharing, so there's no difference in how they profit share in their organisation. OHP with their cost centre, profit centre model, there are differences, and that's what they've decided to live with. But yes, any new business coming into the organisation is in the central pot, and that's shared across all. Yeah. Does that answer your 3 points? Try and keep it brief.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the effect of these recruitment. Have you found that the practices have had more success in recruiting doctors and otherwise as part of these superstructures, or are people more put off
Yeah, okay, it's an interesting point. So again, the two organisations are at different stages of their development, but both organisations have internal locum pools. So they've got locums that are working specifically with them and working around the different locations. The West Midlands is a little, well, not unique, but it's privileged in some ways to have a really good medical school and a really good set of GP trainees. So they're not struggling with the recruitment of GP trainees in the West Midlands as much as we are in the East Midlands and certainly in other parts of the country. A lot of their recruitment is coming from ST3s working in the practices and wanting to stay with the organisation, being very interested in the organisation going forward. So in terms of recruiting like-for-like replacements, that's tended to come from the ST3 pool so far. I was with some of the practices the other day and they had an advert out for salaried doctor, and they'd had 22 applicants, where the average number of applicants across West Midlands practices for salaried doctors is 3. So if that's soft intelligence, it feels like a bit of soft intelligence to me that there is some interest in these shared and collaborative ways of working. One of the things that more established doctors find a little bit harder to get their heads around is maybe working in one site one day and somewhere else another. It's horses for courses. Some people are okay with it and some people aren't, but it doesn't seem to be creating too many issues. The cohort of staff that have really embraced it, particularly in Midlands Medical Partnership, is the nurse team. They've really embraced collaborative working. For instance, Extended Access is a nurse-led service in Midlands Medical Partnership, run completely by nurses, shared by nurses, and they work in different locations every week. So, you know, thank goodness for that, I say. Phlebotomy is shared very easily across the organisation. So there are some aspects of collaborative working and merged partnerships that are easier to achieve quickly than others. Practice managers tend to work really well together across the organisation, and the ethos for both of these organisations has very much been I hate the term, but natural wastage. So as people move on, you replace with something different. So there's been no mass renegotiation of contracts or anything like that. It's all been fairly managed since their inception.
2 questions for you, Sarah. I've been slightly surprised that we haven't had any more questions about your concept behind a specialist practice manager rather than a generalist. And I'm kind of looking at the practice managers in the room thinking, wow,
I think it's because we all know it.
What
I
is
think
that?
probably.
Fine, okay.
We all know that, don't we?
I'm the ignorant one here. I'll move on.
Well, no, I know as a practice manager that I can't get through the day if I have to be everything to everybody all day. You have to build teams of people that you work with that can take on elements of that responsibility. So I think covertly as practice managers, we've probably been working on that for a while. I think the fact that the government wants to fund us to think about things, hallelujah, but I think we're probably all on the same page unless anybody's going to disagree with me.
I suppose I gave the example this morning of an airline pilot. You get on the aircraft and you expect the pilot to fly the plane but know nothing about the HR issues of the staff behind, the fueling, the maintenance, etc., etc. And I think that's probably now becoming very much the case in general practice, that we need specialists because these areas are now very complex when it comes to management. Which in a way brings me on to the second question, and that is I'm slightly surprised that none of these super partnerships have gone into limited company status, or you haven't mentioned it if they have, because of the protection that would afford the individual partners.
Yeah.
You know, if one of your groups starts seriously collapsing and folding financially, the others are equally and severally liable for that. Tell us a bit more about limited company status.
So both organisations are looking at it and thinking about it. So our health partnership are very much focusing on property ownership and thinking about limited liability for property ownership as their big thing. I think we've been slightly misled or tripped up by GMS regulations over a period of time telling us that we can't be limited companies. I think that's been challenged and I think we'll see some move away from that as we move forward. I certainly hope that those CCG areas that are moving towards thinking about MCP models or accountable care organisations are thinking very carefully about allowing general practice to work in a different way in terms of the traditional partnership model. What I would say with both organisations, they're keeping a watching brief. And when the time's right, they'll jump on the limited company status and get on with it. I think that's the...
I mean, a limited company can hold a GMS contract. That's not the issue. The issue is whether the NHS England will allow them to do a contract variation without going out to a national tender, out to a procurement process, which of course is unbelievably clunky, and they aren't guaranteed to get it.
Yes.
So wake up NHS England. I don't think anybody's from NHS England is actually in the room. There's lots of CCG representatives, but we want them. I know, it's just falling on deaf ears. But yes, you're absolutely right. They need to wake up to the fact that the partnership model in some areas is simply not fit for purpose anymore. It needs to be much more progressive in terms of...
And again, some areas in practice are doing okay still with the partnership model. So I reflect on my own example in a practice at the moment. We're in a grouping of 6 practices locally, and there's some talk about do we work together differently, but it's not really moving much in Derbyshire because there's not really been a driver for it. But out of the 6 practices in the locality, 4 have had adverts out for partners of late. We were one of them. The other 3 practices have not managed to recruit a partner at all or even generate interest in their advert. We've just offered 3 partnerships. Yeah. So the partnership model isn't dead. How you attract people to the partnership model is critical and important. And if you can't adapt your partnership to attract new recruits, then you might as well give up now, because partners aren't looking to... There are GPs out there looking for partnerships, but they're looking to work in a different way than maybe the traditional setup that we know of in the partnership model.
Yeah, we'll watch this space.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, I was going to thank Sarah very much indeed. Really appreciate you coming back to Derby to talk about that and to stimulate more conversation. I just wanted to go back to my original presentation this morning. I'm just going to put that slide up once again, because something that Sarah alluded to was that you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the GMS contract is critically important in maintaining income, but finding innovative solutions around and extending that is very important. And John Cotter in this book actually, interestingly, talks about maintaining the core service whilst putting around it the innovative team that then drives the organisation forward, and the new innovations get embedded behind. And I really recommend people read this book because it is extremely innovative. For those of you that are observant and actually read the front of your booklet this morning, it has quite an interesting quote on the front. I won't read it all, but part of it says, as a guiding philosophy, optimism trumps pessimism. And today has been about optimism, and we've really tried to instill some optimism in you throughout the entire day. But it also says, after all, the future doesn't just happen. We make it happen. And you've heard during the course of the day, you started out with Chris Ham talking about the strength of general practice and how the foundations of the NHS are actually being challenged at this moment in time, i.e. general practice is really being challenged. But he also said that primary care should lead integration and should start to help to break down the barriers, and that we have choices as general practitioners and primary care leaders in how that is driven forward. He also made it very, very clear in his talk this morning that today and everything isn't about working harder, it's working smarter and differently. And you've had every opportunity today to hear people that are working smarter and have answers for you about how to work smarter from tomorrow onwards, and also to feel more optimistic about your futures. And I really hope you've been able to benefit from that, and you've spoken to people and you've taken contacts, and we've tried to encourage you to do that within your booklet. But of course, a lot of the contacts are already in here, and everybody that's spoken to you today is willing to be contacted one way or another to give you more advice and more help. You heard Heidi and Nina this morning also talking about challenging and changing the skill mix within practices, improving access, but the key theme through those were increasing training and making sure people actually can do the job you want them to do, and in order to try and reduce individuals' workload. Richard went on to talk about how he's talking to 8 practices, But he started off by saying we are asking the questions before we're coming up with the solutions. And that's what we as an LMC are trying to do. We're trying to really delve deeply into finding why there is this widening gap between the practices that are struggling and potentially on this dreadful spiral downwards, but yet there are strong practices that are forging forward and are looking to the future. This afternoon, Steve and Caroline spoke very well about primary care home and how that's working in areas and how that is, yes, delivering fantastic care for vulnerable patients, but it's also relieving workload and addressing some of the challenges that practices are facing by putting the focus in a different way and making sure we build and develop multidisciplinary teams. And Sarah has kindly finished off by talking about super partnerships and how they too are working and how they're looking at delivering care in much larger groups. And yes, we've had some challenges about whether large is best overall. It's for you to make your decisions about what best works for you. But there are some fantastic opportunities. And as I have said throughout the day on I don't know how many occasions, the three messages I want you to take home, that there are solutions and opportunities, if only we can open our eyes to them, that the current business model of isn't working particularly well for patients or the practices and the staff within them, and we must start looking much more as innovative, small to medium-sized enterprises and serious businesses. And then we'll start really moving forward in a strong business style. And finally, that the LMC really is trying to help you to move forward. We're looking at, as I say, researching this widening gap, trying to look at the solutions that are going on around the country and locally and pulling those in together so that you can have access to them locally. But I'm delighted that I've had one or two people come up to me saying we're really interested in understanding more about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And therefore I'm opening the offer up to everybody. If you really are interested, we are looking for people to help us with this project, doctors and practice managers that can come and help us to make sure we are giving you as an LMC what you are purchasing from us and what you deserve, along with the partners that you will have spoken to out there in the function room. So, just to finish off, first and foremost, please give us back your feedback forms. They are critical for the development of what you need and for the way we can run these future conferences for you. I want to thank all our speakers in particular that have come from far and wide and those that have come locally and spoken to us and hopefully inspired you to go back and do something tomorrow to start making a difference. Well done to all of them and thank you very much. I of course want to thank the LMC team and all the hard work that has gone into coordinating today and making it work for you, and in particular Helen, who has worked tirelessly. She's told me she's had hundreds of emails a day about this over the last week. Helen, hopefully your inbox is empty when you get home tomorrow or into the office to actually, surprisingly, Helen's taking tomorrow off, and boy, she deserves it. And I'm just going to finish off by giving you a quote from a song I was playing in my car on the way this morning, a Mumford & Sons song, I Gave You All is the name of the tune. It says, "If I had an enemy greater than my apathy, I would have won." I will leave you with that message. Thank you all very much for coming.